Hello, Igniting Community. I'm Doris Forrester, and I'm back with another global population and gender talk. Today's talk is the last of my four-part series on human trafficking. The first two talks, the focus was on general patterns of trafficking, looking at who the victims are, who the offenders are, methods of trafficking, different forms of trafficking, and global patterns. The last talk I just did was on two of the areas that the United Nations has identified as areas that should be addressed to combat human trafficking. So the United Nations, through the Palermo Protocol of 2000, decided on a 3P paradigm that is very victim focused on, and so the 3Ps are the prevention and the protection, and that's what I talked about last talk. And prosecution. And prosecution is what I'm going to talk about today. Prosecution needs to involve more than just taking somebody to court and prosecuting them. It needs to, first of all, being identifying and arresting, prosecuting, convicting, and then having the punishment, so the penalty. And the penalty needs to be stiff, it needs to be harsher, and we need to be once convicted, these individuals need to be in jail for a longer period of time. I don't have data on penalties. The data I do have is outdated, but what I have found is historically the penalties are not very severe, and a lot of people are out in the community very quickly, and they tend to reoffend. So this talk is going to focus on those areas, and I'm using the data from the United Nations Annual Report in 2020 to show what's going on in the world. So I'm going to talk about this first globally, and then I'm going to look at some of the regions in more detail. So globally, we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at investigated and arrested. That's figure 15. Figure 16 looks at prosecuted, and then figure 17 is looking at those that have been convicted. The first thing you're going to you should be able to see throughout each one of those figures is that over 60% of those that are being arrested, prosecuted, or convicted are male globally. But what I want to alert your attention to is this piece of data right here. So globally, we have 40 million people that are estimated to be victims of human trafficking. Today, only 9,429 people have been investigated or arrested. Out of that, 7,368 people have been prosecuted, so 2,000 people were not prosecuted, and they were probably back in the community reoffending if they were guilty. From that, 3,553 were actually convicted of the crime of human trafficking, and so that's a big drop. That's almost half, and so we have to do a better job. So what needs to happen to really combat human trafficking is that, first of all, the numbers have to be much higher than what's being presented. But between arresting and prosecuting, it should be a closer value between the two. And then conviction and prosecution should be a closer value as well. This visual I like because it's showing who the convicted offenders are between male, female, boys and girls. And boys and girls would be those individuals under 18 years old. And what I find interesting is that we do have boys and girls. We don't have specifics on their age, but we do have areas where a certain percentage of the offenders being convicted are boys and are girls. And it's a couple of things. It could be that these boys and girls are actually being coerced into participating. They are victims of trafficking themselves. Or it could be that the crimes are less, or the penalty for these crimes is less for children than it is for adults. So these individuals, the boys and the girls, become the fall girls and fall boys for the adults. So the adults continue to commit those crimes, but it's young children, young boys and young girls that are taking the punishment and being convicted of the crimes. The other interesting thing with this table is the difference between male and female. And you can see that the richer the region in terms of economic development, social development, more men are being convicted than females. In areas of the world where economic development is less, people are struggling more, social programs are not as developed, we see that there's almost an even split like we do in Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America and the Caribbean, and South America, or predominantly there's more women being convicted than there are men. And we see that in East Asia Pacific and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Now, again, there's a couple things we can consider here. Maybe women are not treated the same in the courts that men are. And because of that inequality, they tend to be convicted at a higher rate. The other one could be that there's more women that are offenders than men in these regions, and I don't know if I believe that. And the other one is it's easier for these women to take the blame than it is for men, so they set these women up to be the fall ladies for, I don't know what else to call them, but to be the ones that take the punishments, are the ones that are convicted, the ones that are prosecuted, where the males are not prosecuted to the same degree, which is very telling. Another piece of data globally is looking at who the offenders are, and 74% of the offenders are local nationals, so they live in the area that they're committing the offense. 18% are living within the region, but not necessarily the country, and then 8% are from other regions. And the issue here becomes that 18% and that 8%, it's very difficult to find them, to convict them, prosecute them, because they live in other countries. And once you start blending different countries, different levels of government, but different international governments and different laws for different countries, it becomes really, really complicated. This data is just showing between countries of origin, where 95% of the convicted offenders are national offenders, versus countries of destination, where we have 48% that are national offenders versus 52% that are foreign. And here it becomes more complicated and more complex to actually arrest, prosecute, and convict, because again, we have so many countries that are involved in so many regions, and the boundaries, and this is particularly in Europe, where the countries are very small in area. The European Union allows people to go from one country to another very easily, and you can cross international borders very, very fast. So it's difficult to arrest. It's very difficult to prosecute because there's different laws in different countries, and then we have very difficult to have conviction. It's actually happening. And I just want to point out, this is the global average, and you can see that all the regions here are convicting at a rate less, and those regions tend to be not as economically developed. And then we've got this one region that is convicting at a much, much higher rate than the global average, and that is Europe and Central Asia, which tells me one of two things. They have more money, so they're not as dependent on money coming from human trafficking as other regions. So they're more vigilant in pursuing and prosecutions and convictions. They have more money to do so, whereas the countries that are not convicting at the same rate don't have the resources, but they also, the people living there are very dependent and putting pressure on governments. So we're going to look at Western Europe, and these would be the countries that after World War II did not become communist. Their economies are much more developed than the rest of Europe. They're richer, their social programs are more established. And if we look again at the investigated, arrested in Figure 98, Figure 99 looking at prosecuted, and looking at Figure 100 looking at convictions, we can see that the convictions are about a third of those that have been investigated or arrested. And we see this systematic decrease from arrest, prosecution, and conviction. And the numbers are low. Western Europe is a hot spot for human trafficking, and there's way more people, I believe, involved than what we're seeing there. This is the only region that actually highlights, sorry, there's something there, that actually highlights the different breakdown of the foreign offenders. So we have national offenders comprising the greater percentage of offenders, but we have a real spread of offenders from different areas. So, you know, in 2018, we have 64% coming from different parts of the world. And again, it's that level, an extra level of complexity, and I think that's why the numbers are so low. Here the global average is, and we can see Western and Southern Europe having conviction rates actually lower than other parts of Europe. So we're going to move now to Central and Southeastern Europe, and these would be the countries after World War II that did not join the USSR, but they were communist, and their economies are not as developed. And if you look at the numbers, 530 people arrested, 390 prosecuted, and only 88 convicted. First of all, these numbers are super low, but the difference between those that are being arrested and those that are being convicted, there's what a drop. What a drop. 84% of those individuals are national offenders. And when you compare the national offenders to the foreign offenders for Western and Southern Europe and Central and Southeastern Europe, you can see these are the destination countries. This is where a lot of the victims are coming. Their economies are not as strong, so that need to work abroad is stronger here. These are the areas that a lot of the traffic victims are going, and a lot of this is for sexual exploitation. And again, we have 64%, and that's quite high, and it becomes really, like I said, complex. But here, they're not going after them. You can see 530, that number is so low. Now we're going to look at Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So these would have been the countries that were part of the USSR. And their economies, again, were not as developed as the West. So here, there's an error here. So I'm just going to look at these two figures. And here we're seeing a lot more women, predominantly, being prosecuted and convicted than men. And this is where I'm thinking there's something not right, that only women, I don't know what it is, but we're not getting a clear picture on really what the issue is. So we had 493 people prosecuted and 475 actually convicted. And when you look at that, you think there's not that big of a difference. But I think there's a whole group of people that are not even being looked at. That is just my observation. So now we're going to look at East Asia and Pacific. And we can see again, predominantly it's women that are being convicted. And looking at the numbers, we can see there's not a big difference between those that are being arrested and those that are being convicted. And only a slight decrease in those that are being arrested, those that are being prosecuted. And then we just have a slight decrease in those that are being convicted, but I don't think this is giving us a clear picture by any means. 95% of those convicted are national offenders. We are going to move over to the Canada and Mexico, and I don't know why the U.S. is missing, and we're going to look at Central America and the Caribbean. Here we're looking at only 256 people. That number is so low, we are not doing a good job here at all. Okay, it's 256 prosecuted, 85. Less than half actually being convicted. And when we look at Central America and the Caribbean, we can see 270, or that again, there's an error there, but 564 to 71, that's huge. And the numbers again are not very high. We are going to move now to South America, and we can look at, there's again, these numbers, there's something wrong here, so we'll just focus here. 575 and only 149 convicted. So a big discrepancy between those that are being prosecuted and those that are being convicted. So they're prosecuting them, but they're not ending up being found guilty of their crimes. 84% are national offenders. Now we're going to move over to Africa. We're going to look at Sub-Saharan Africa. And here we're looking at a big difference. 1,092 arrested or investigated. 348 have been prosecuted, and only 121. So again, this region, they need to do a better job at, once you arrest them, is taking them to trial and then convicting them. 78% are national offenders. Now we're going to look at our Middle East and North Africa. And here there is a discrepancy. I just wanted to present the data, but it looks like we have 850 people investigated. There's no data on who's been convicted. So this is an area that is either holding back that data, or they're not collecting that data, or worst case scenario, people are being prosecuted but being found innocent, and I can't see that happening. And 70% of those are national offenders. So here we have some rich countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and some trafficking happening here, and governments are not being as vigilant as they should be. So that's just giving you a quick overview of what's going on in the world. We need to do a better job at identifying and arresting offenders, prosecuting them, and then ultimately convicting them. And until we do that, we're always going to have this problem. And it's the economies of a lot of countries that are not equipped, or they're not capable or not able to do these things. And that's it for me now. For now, have a great day. Be kind, everyone.